Just giving everybody a minute to log on. Okay, I would like to welcome everybody to our third and final Radical Days presentation, Planting for Pollinators. I'd like to thank RAD for all their great funding of the community garden program in Allegheny County. I'd also like to thank Next Era Energy for their donations for our pollinator plantings at several gardens, which you're about to hear about. And everybody that comes out and volunteers in the community gardens every year, especially this year, given the circumstances. Let me introduce Lori Bofolt. She is our community gardens coordinator and will be giving today's presentation on pollinating gardens.
Great, thanks, Art. So we're going to be talking about planting for pollinators. And I'm going to, in this presentation, go over the pollination process and some basic flower parts that pertain to pollination, the state of pollinators versus native pollinators versus cultivated ones. And then I want to talk about our projects that the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy does. And I also want to highlight some solutions to common garden issues that homeowners might find. And there will be some plant profiles included with that as well. Quick introduction to native bees and butterflies. And then we'll sort of wrap it up with what you can do at home and a list of resources. And then at the very end, I'll answer questions in the Q&A portion of the chat, so you can be adding those as I'm going through if you have any. All right, so what's pollination? Simply put, it's a key component to plant reproduction, and it occurs when the stamen of the plant, which is the male part and contains pollen, when the pollen on the stamen gets transferred to the stigma, which is at the top of the female part of the plant. So once the pollen gets on the stigma, these little pollen tubes are formed and it travels down into the ovule, again, part of the female part of the plant, and that's where seeds are formed. So how does the pollen get from the stamen to the stigma? Some plants rely on wind pollination, so wind carrying pollen or water, but 75% of our native plants rely on, you guessed it, pollinators. So some pollinators like bees will intentionally move pollen because they rely on it for nutrition and to feed their young, but other pollinators carry pollen grains inadvertently, and it just happens to be transferred when they're nesting or foraging for food or nectar. Many plants have evolved methods to ensure that pollinators are doing the legwork for them. And one of those methods includes the actual shape of how a flower is structured. So a lot of flowers are precisely engineered to fit the body parts of the animals that pollinate them. And I wanted to show this picture here. This was taken at our Huntington Bay Welcome Garden at the Fort Pitt Tunnels, which is one of our largest gardens, and I think one that a lot of people are familiar with. This is a picture of a clearwing moth. So that's a native pollinator, and it's feeding on one of our annual salvia plants that's planted there. And you can see the long proboscis of the moth here sort of fits perfectly into these more tubular flowers, and that is absolutely by design. So that encourages, you know, when the moth sticks its long tongue in there to get the nectar, it's sort of brushing the pollen off and carrying it down to the stigma. There are other methods that plants will use to entice pollinators to move their pollen around for them. And one of those is called nectar guides. So this photo, well, both of these I think pretty clearly illustrate how those work. So you can see on, this is a bee balm. There are nectar guides on this, oh, I'm sorry. Nectar guides on that one too. But on this, at the base of the flower tube here, those white lines direct insects toward the center of the tube where they will find the nectar. The same thing is happening here with this Rudbeckia. This is a flower fly. And the petals of this flower here are directing and essentially guiding the insect to the teeny tiny flowers that are part of the disc here. That's where the nectar is, so that's where this fellow wants to be. And of course, this isn't just a one-way street. This is a great example of symbiosis. So plants and animals sort of evolving simultaneously. And as a reward for the insect helping with reproduction, it gets energy and nutrients through pollen and nectar, and also a place to rest on the petals and leaves. And then this next slide is a picture of a violet. And again, I just included this because you can really clearly see these nectar guides here. And you can also see the pollen sort of sitting right there. So you can imagine if an insect is climbing in that plant, they're brushing against that. So just some interesting facts. Some plant species do rely on a single species of pollinator for reproduction. This is called specialization. Cross-pollination, which occurs when a pollinator is visiting multiple plants, increases genetic diversity and is highly desirable in plants and keeping ecosystems healthy. I found that honeybees, which I must note are not native pollinators, they have been imported, originally European, to be used to help in agriculture. So you can sort of think of them as like cattle or something like that. And they are, you know, tended to intentionally, but they're really cool because they've been used to deliver biological controls. I read an article about honeybees dispersing a biological control that protects blueberry crops from a fungal disease. And then native bees contribute approximately $3 billion of pollination services to food crops. So they do a lot of the same legwork that honeybees do for us. And the last I found, which I did not know, bats are the primary pollinators for agave plants, which are used for making tequila. So without bats, we would not be able to have any margaritas. And so we need to talk about pollinator decline, particularly in the United States. So according to the Xerces Society, which is an organization dedicated to research on pollinators, we've seen 5 species of butterflies become extinct in the past 70 years. Of 800 US butterfly species, almost 20% are at risk for extinction. And then the Center for Biological Diversity did a study of US native bee populations and found that over half are declining and 1 in 4 are imperiled. And a lot of the reasons listed for that include invasive plant species, which are a poor source of nutrition for our native pollinators, habitat loss, which is the loss of foraging and nesting habitat, climate change, which disrupts the distribution of pollinators and plants. So if, say, a monarch needs to be on a milkweed when it's blooming in June, and the monarchs in our area in June, but it's been a really hot spring and the milkweed has already bloomed and gone, you know, starting to go to seed. There's not nearly as much nectar, so that affects the health of the monarch butterfly. Overuse and misuse of pesticides, and then just a lack of awareness. So, you know, a lot of people are worried about honeybees and stuff like that, but when we learn more and more about our native bees, you know, you start to think of more and more ways that you can help protect them. So what is the solution? Planting native plants, perennials, and nectar-rich plants favored by pollinators is probably the easiest answer for individuals. And that National Research Council does support that as well. So now that we've learned about what's going on with pollinators, I would like to highlight some of the projects that the Conservancy has implemented recently involving pollinators and planting plants that are beneficial. So I'm going to start with this rain garden project, which is at the intersection of Lincoln and Frankstown Avenues in Lincoln-Larimer neighborhood. This project was started in 2019 and completed installation this year, so just this summer actually. And it was supported by the Richard King Mellon Foundation, as well as Next Era Energy, who Art mentioned earlier, and was made possible through partnership with Pittsburgh Public Schools, PWSA, Pittsburgh Community Services, and the City of Pittsburgh. So this is how the garden looked prior to it being redesigned. It has been a community garden of ours since 1995 on a vacant lot. And it was a garden that we planted every year with annual flowers in the bed here, which you can see. And the students and staff at Lincoln Pre-K through 5 volunteered with us every year. The school is adjacent to the property. The students would come and help us plant as well as clean up the bed. But we were having some issues with the site, which there were old foundations underneath. The ground was heaving and settling. And this is just another illustration of how it looked prior to the retrofit of the rain garden. But when we were discussing plans for this, we wanted to make sure, you know, that we were talking to Lincoln Pre-K through 5. And after some of those conversations, we decided that it would be great to convert the site to a teaching rain garden that would support pollinators and could be used as an extension of outdoor classroom time. So we broke ground on construction. So you can see there was some leveling, the rain garden basins were installed. And then it's a diagram from the engineering firm that helped us. And then the plant selection, I wanted to show that the planting was considered as planting in mass, which is really beneficial to pollinators. It gives them more plants to choose from when foraging. So we had originally hoped that the students at Lincoln Pre-K through 5 would be able to join us for planting. Obviously, COVID-19 threw a wrench in those plans. So our staff planted the 190 perennials and 6 trees this year. And like I said, was completed early this spring. And we're hoping, you know, once school is able to return to normal, the students and teachers will be able to use the garden as an outdoor classroom. And then just some more pictures. So this has been this year, so it's filled in really nicely. And I think, you know, that's just a result of having chosen primarily natives or cultivars of native plants, and that are well adapted to our climate. Yeah, it actually looks really nice. I'm excited. And so this is sort of how it's going to be structured throughout, where I'll talk about a project, and then following that, we'll go over some plants that were used in the design. And so, you know, if you have a notepad or anything like that, I've highlighted, you know, if they tolerate drought or clay soil, what sort of pollinator they can attract, and I use specific species when I could find them. And then as well as, you know, whether they're deer resistant or something like that. So here I'm highlighting plants that work well in areas that receive both a large amount of moisture as well as drought, which is what a rain garden sees. So Liatris spicata, which is blazing star. It's a beautiful, tallish, mid-height architectural perennial. Cardinal flower, really attractive to hummingbirds. It blooms a little bit later in the season and is great for wet soils. It's also deer resistant. And I want to preface this by saying everything I say deer resistant, deer in our area will take a bite out of pretty much anything to see if they can eat it. So that means that if they do get eaten by a deer, you know, they don't have it's not going to kill them. They regenerate pretty quickly, and the deer might not like the taste. And then anise hyssop, which I really love. It's in the mint family, and you'll find that a lot of plants in the mint family attract bees and other pollinators and are also not as attractive to deer. So this is one plant that was designated as an exceptional nectar source for native bees. And we snapped this picture of a checkered skipper butterfly on the plant just this summer. Eastern blue star, Ramsonia, is one of my favorites. I have this at my house, but it's a larval host plant of the coral hairstreak butterfly. It's also really important when planting for pollinators to think about early spring nectar forage. So this is something that blooms in our area, usually April to May, depending on how the weather has gone, which makes it an important source of nectar for native bees, because that's when they're sort of starting to move around again, and there's not nearly as much food and nutrition as there might be in the summertime. And then next I'd like to highlight one of our garden sites. It's at the 2230-60 interchange on the Parkway West near Robinson Town Center. And this is a site that holds water. So we're going to be talking about sort of some plants that you can use for wet sites. And this is not a result of engineering like a rain garden is, it's a result of runoff and heavy clay soil. So this garden has been supported by CNX, and CNX employees come out with us many times a year to help maintain the garden. They do weeding with us, and they helped us plant the perennial bed early this summer. So again, new bed was installed this year, but you can see here the ponding that occurs, and that often will sit for days, and it's just due to the heavy clay and the amount of runoff that the site receives. And then this is about 2 or 3 months after planting, how it looks. So in the past, you know, we had been concerned about the wetness there. We were having a really hard time getting a lot of the plants we planted to survive. So we kind of thought maybe let's just lean into that, and designed so that this area, which, so this is the design, which is what abuts the particularly wet section of ground, using plants that we know like to have wet feet. So don't mind sitting water for a while, and that maybe even could help absorb and mitigate some of that runoff. And this has been a really dry summer, so you can't be positive that it's working yet, but, and one of those is blue flag iris. It's a native iris. So a lot of people, myself included, have like Siberian irises in their yard, but there is a really nice alternative that likes standing water, likes clay soil, and is deer resistant. Culvers Root, which is a really beautiful architectural, narrow growing plant, and it gets between 4 and 6 feet tall. It does not mind having wet feet. Again, deer resistant. At my house, the deer took a bite out of mine, but they came back and they left it alone afterward. And once again, it's another important late spring, early summer nectar source, starts blooming in June and will persist throughout the season. And then great blue lobelia, really enjoys wet soil, does well in part shade, attracts native bees. And once again, you can notice these nectar lines here and these tubular flowers, which is something that bees search out when they're looking for forage. And then Pye Weed, which is a plant that can, depending on the type that you can get, you can find smaller varieties, and there are a handful of species that are called Pye Weed that look similar, and they're native, so they're all okay to plant. But it can get up to 7 feet tall. Sweet Pye Weed does tolerate partial shade. All of them like wet soil, are deer resistant, and again, a narrow, tall, sort of back of the border, or even specimen plant. And you'll find a ton of bees and butterflies on this if you plant it. New York Ironweed, another tall plant, likes wet soil. So you'll notice that like our iris is blooming in early spring. We have our Culvers Root blooming kind of mid to late spring. And then summer, midsummer, we've got the Pye Weed. And then end of summer, New York Ironweed. So, you know, you get a full season of nectar for pollinators. This grows well on slopes, tolerates wet soil, is deer resistant. Again, bees and butterflies. Then another garden is a small garden at the intersection of 5th Avenue and Kirkpatrick Street in the Hill District. This was a site that had a lot of deer browse. And, oh, sorry about that. Prior, we had only had an annual bed here. And then, you know, we started this idea of retrofitting the garden to include a small pollinator component. It's not a huge space, but it's really made a beautiful difference. So this is Monarda, which has been planted there, again, in the mint family. This is a cultivar. So cultivars of native plants are called nativars, and that just means some desirable characteristics have been taken from 2 different species, or even the same species that maybe had a couple different forms, and bred together to make maybe a different looking plant. So this cultivar is red. Not all bee balm is. You'll find pink, blue, or I'm sorry, purple, not blue. But it tolerates wet soil well. This particular one is resistant to powdery mildew, so that's a good choice if you do have wet soil, but it can tolerate some dryness too. And Coreopsis we planted at this garden, again for its deer resistance. And I was able to find the particular bees that this will attract there. And then this is our one of our field staff, Matt, who designed this garden. So he was responsible for the beautiful assortment of pollinator plants you see here. And then I also wanted to talk about the Huntington Bank Gateway Garden at the Fort Pitt Tunnels. And this is a space where we have to address roadside concerns. So salt spray, as well as wind and pollution. It's, you know, one of the gardens that I think folks in our area are probably most familiar with. It looks stunning every year. And we like to incorporate a mix, hopefully, you know, we try to hit about 50-50 mix of annuals and perennials in our gardens, our community gardens, so that we have year-round interest as well as the opportunity every year to engage community volunteers with helping us plant the annuals for this bright, colorful impact. Annuals can also play a really important role in providing nectar for migrating pollinators from spring through fall. A lot of annuals bloom all season. So I've dedicated the next few slides to highlighting some of the more valuable nectar sources in annual flowers and what you can think about when choosing annuals for your garden. So zinnias, particularly Zinnia elegans, which is what State Fair zinnias come from. They are pretty happy in full sun, don't take as much water, they're not very water intensive. And then zinnia's native range is Mexico and Central America, and they attract hummingbirds and butterflies. And then thinking about migration patterns in pollinators, a lot of hummingbirds and butterflies in the summer are migrating from Central America and Mexico further north. So having these nectar plants available that are native to the pollinators' homeland actually works out really well, and may not be the backbone of your pollinator garden, but can certainly enhance it. So these were pictures we took at this site at the Fort Pitt tunnels, and you can see bees really like zinnias, and we've seen a lot of butterflies, particularly zebra swallowtails on them. And then salvia, there's annual salvia and perennial salvia. Again, native to Mexico and Texas. We're attracting similar idea, hummingbirds, bees, butterflies, and these annuals do extremely well with low water. And then annual black-eyed Susan. So annual is sort of a misnomer for this. Annual means a plant completes its life cycle in 1 year, or that will not overwinter in a particular area. This Rudbeckia is biennial, which means it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. So Rudbeckia hirta is native to our area. And obviously some of these annuals are cultivars of that, but this one is short-lived, so that's why it's grown as an annual here. And I believe this is an orange sulfur butterfly, but yes. So back to perennials. At the Fort Pitt tunnel garden, there are gorgeous patches of milkweed. And I think, if you have an interest in monarchs, maybe remember from school that milkweed is a really important plant to monarch butterflies. It's the host plant for the butterfly, which means that this is the only genus of plants that provide the adequate nutrition for the larva, which is pictured on the right here, of the monarch butterfly to eat and develop correctly. So without this plant, no monarchs. And what I love about these pictures is it's just really good evidence that planting the right thing and something that's beneficial in a small space. So for instance, between, 6 lanes of traffic makes a nice and recordable impact. So once again, this was taken at the Huntington Bake Welcome Garden at the Fort Pitt tunnels. But common milkweed is one type of milkweed that is planted there. It smells really beautiful, starts blooming in June, although in recent years, anecdotally, I've seen mine blooming as early as May. And it attracts swallowtails, again, monarchs. It's a crucial plant for monarchs. Viceroys, which look like monarch butterflies. A red admiral, which is what's pictured here. And variegated fritillaries and painted lady butterflies. Yarrow is also at this garden. It's special value to native bees and deer resistant. And switchgrass. So a lot of grasses are really important for pollinators, and this is a larval host for a couple of skippers, which or not quite butterflies, not quite moths in the middle. And then I wanted to move on to talking about shady sites. So this is a garden. It's at Beechwood Boulevard and Reynolds Street in the Point Breeze neighborhood that we had sort of struggled to, because the garden had originally been fairly sunny, and then as the trees matured around it, areas were starting to become shaded out. So we installed a small bed this past spring, which I'll talk a little more about when we talk about small space gardening, as well as a garden that's at 11th Street in East Carson in the south side. This is another sort of part shade to heavy shade garden. So you'll notice a lot of like foliage plants in there, as well as river birches, and birch trees are actually good pollinator host plants. And once again, Wenzel and Broadway, which is in Dormont, it's a shady site. So more shade back in this area, more sun in this area. And I just wanted to highlight the hydrangea that's used there. It's smooth hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens, which is a native. I believe this is a cultivar of a native planted here, but it's the larval host of the hydrangea sphinx moth. Columbine, again, one of those important early spring nectar sources, and there are different species of columbine, but the canadensis is what you want to look for if you're trying to buy a native variety. And then Squirrel Hill Tunnels gardens have a couple of, maybe common issues people might see while gardening. Certainly urban conditions is one of those. So again, salt spray, wind, air pollution. And while the area of the actual space that we plant in is large, we're planting in concrete pots. So small space container gardening. And these perennials were planted. So we have Coreopsis here, which I think I spoke about earlier, or it's coming up, and nine bark, which is a beautiful shrub. It does actually get large, but you can prune to keep it small. There are some dwarf varieties available. And in the winter, when the leaves fall off, there's this beautiful cinnamon colored peeling bark left. And then, like I mentioned before, Beechwood and Reynolds. So this space where we installed that sort of shady bed was just a portion of lawn that was sod removed and tilled, so about 10 feet wide. So if you are planting in a small space, which I think a lot of people, especially if you live in the city, are, utilizing containers is a great way to keep some perennials nearby. You can use smaller containers. The only thing you want to think about for when choosing that, so mature size of the plant, it's going to be the mature size of the roots pretty closely. And then native plants have very deep roots, so you want to make sure you're using deep containers. You can also convert a really small section of lawn to a pollinator plot, or you can find dwarf cultivars of native plants. Species without a cultivar is always most desirable, but cultivars can and should be utilized, when you need to. So if you are choosing cultivars, you want to opt for single flowered varieties. Those usually have more nectar. And then be sure that what you're choosing has not been treated with pesticides. You can also utilize annuals for nectar if you don't want to go full-blown pulling out your lawn. You can plant some annuals in existing beds. You can also plant small sections of new perennials in existing beds. And then cosmos, sunflowers, but you have to choose ones that do produce seeds because there are a lot out there that don't. Mexican hat, which is a Rudbeckia species, and blanket flower are all great annuals for nectar. And you can also use your herb garden to feed pollinators. Swallowtail butterflies, dill can be a host plant for them. Bee balm, which again we talked about a little bit earlier, A lot of people grow in their herb garden to use the leaves for tea. It's a great bee plant. And then alliums, which are those ornamental onions or even chives and stuff like that. If you let them go to flower, bees will visit those as well. But if you only have room for one plant, make it milkweed. So again, this is the common milkweed that we talked about. And then this is what's called butterfly weed, which is a smaller variety of milkweed. And I have a plant slide on that in just a bit. Winterberry is a small, you can find dwarf varieties of it. So anywhere 3 to 12 feet, a beautiful shrub. It does not mind being wet, and you do need both a male and a female plant to get this berry production. And wherever you're purchasing it, whomever's working there will be able to help you find that. And I have a short list of some places to purchase plants at the end. But it's the larval host of Henry's elfin butterfly. You're going to get birds eating these beautiful berries in the winter, and it stays attractive, year round, which is really important as well. And then butterflies will pollinate the inconspicuous flowers in the spring and summer. And another garden that faces some challenges with roadside conditions is the garden at McIntyre McKnight Roads in Ross Township. And you can see we use a lot of purple coneflower there. So purple coneflower echinacea is reliable. You'll find it in, I would say, almost all of our perennial gardens. It's really adaptable to various soil conditions. It's going to attract a lot of butterflies, bees, and then at the end of the season, you can leave the seeds over winter and birds will come to eat your seeds. I get a lot of goldfinches on mine at home. And again, it really is not picky about soil, which is great. Beardtongue, which is Penstemon, it will tolerate dry shade, which can be a challenge. And again, one of those early spring perennials, and it's going to attract bees. And as far as dry sites go, I want to illustrate our garden at Allegheny River Boulevard and Washington Boulevard in the Highland Park area. Does not have an easily reachable water source. So for issues like that, a lot of times we turn to Rudbeckia or Black-Eyed Susan. It tolerates, and you can see the list of attributes here, but it'll put up with a lot. You'll find a lot of bees, butterflies, and birds on this plant as well. And it holds its flowers for a really long time. So it's great. We use that often. This is one of my favorites, Baptisia, which is blue false indigo. And I included this picture here. It is of special value to native bees, but what I really love about it is the flowers are closed, and only an insect that is sort of the right heft to carry the larger pollen granules can get the weighs enough to get the flower to open. So this is a way that the plant protects its pollen from being wasted on a smaller insect that it might not stick to and wouldn't be able to carry it, and just the right guy, which is maybe a native bumble or carpenter bee, carries it to the next flower. And I want to highlight mass planting when possible. So bees forage by sight, and bees are particularly attracted to blue and yellow flowers. So when you plant more than one of the same species in an area, you increase more pollinators and you increase their nectar forage area and attract more pollinators. So those pollinators are what we're primarily going to be talking about, bees and butterflies. But we're not limited to that. Moths, wasps are good pollinators. I found a lot on my Monarda punctata at home. Beetles, hummingbirds, bats, frogs, and turtles. Mayapples, which you find in a lot of woodland areas, are pollinated by turtles. So who are some of our native bees? We have an eastern carpenter bee, a mason bee, leafcutter bee, and there are so many, but pollen sticks to the hairs on bees' legs. Bees rely on pollen to feed their young and for energy. And then flowers and bees' tongues have evolved to accommodate each other's needs. So the bee's specialized tongue fits very well into the particular flower it pollinates, and the one that provides the best nutrition to the bees. A lot of our native bees are solitary bees, so they don't live in hives. They might live in, carpenter bees might live in the rafters of your shed, or in mud on the ground. But because they are hiveless, they're much less territorial and most of them are non-aggressive. And bumblebees are really interesting because they can fly in cooler temperatures and lower light levels than many other bees. They perform what's called buzz pollination, which means they grab a flower with their jaws and shake it to dislodge the pollen. And they're great pollinators of wildflowers, tomatoes, and peppers. So if you want to attract bees, you want to plant plants that are full of nectar. That's going to be most of our natives, are brightly colored with petals that are usually blue or yellow or a mixture of these because bees do not see red well, that are sweetly aromatic or have a minty fragrance. Provide landing platforms, so you can sort of see, this is Russian sage here, but you can sort of see there's this little landing platform for a bee to sit on while it's feeding. Both sides of the flower are mirror images of each other, and they're tubular with nectar at the base of the tube, which accommodates longer tongued bees. So butterflies and moths. Life cycle, the egg is laid on or near a host plant, turns into a larva, which must have access to the host plant it needs, becomes a pupa, forms a chrysalis, and then you've got a full-grown butterfly after that. So just some of the butterflies that we've seen in some of our gardens, and then I've included pictures of what their caterpillar stage looks like because I didn't know the spicebush swallowtail had these gigantic eyes on its caterpillar, but it helps keep birds and stuff from taking a large bite out of it because it looks more like a snake. And then to attract butterflies and moths, you want to plant flowers that grow in clusters, so like a milkweed, and have landing platforms. Butterflies prefer brightly colored, red, yellow, orange, and pink. Moths like white or pale colored flowers. Butterflies like flowers that are open during the day when they are foraging. Moths like ones that are open at night as they're more nocturnal. Deeply hidden nectar. Again, they have those very long proboscises, and then have nectar guides present. Oops. And maybe, again, clusters of smaller flowers. So I also just want to mention that a lot of times people will be concerned that they're seeing that something is eating their plants. Often when you're planting outdoors, there aren't nearly as many pests as maybe we worry about. Certainly with like our gardening, vegetable gardening and stuff, that's a little different. But for ornamentals, a lot of times if you see that something's chewing on the leaves of your plant, that actually is a good thing. So that's how the caterpillar or larval stage of a lot of these butterflies and moths get their food. And then this is a milkweed beetle pictured here on a milkweed pod. So milkweeds will, without a doubt, get aphids. One of their aphids' natural predators is this milkweed beetle. So this bug is going to crawl around and eat the aphids and help sort of protect the integrity of the plant. So it's a beneficial insect to monarchs. And another type of milkweed is butterfly weed, which I had mentioned. We're benefiting all of the same as the common milkweed. There's also swamp milkweed. New England aster is a great fall nectar plant. This is a picture at our Lincoln and Frankstown rain garden, blooming right now, and it's a larval host of the pearl crescent butterfly. So we've talked about a lot of plants. What can you do at home? So starting small, like I said, converting just a small patch of lawn to a pollinator garden, maybe removing plants that have, you know, little or no benefit to pollinators and replacing them with something that does. Creating a diversity of bloom. So we want to talk about 3 species for each blooming period. So you want 3 types of plants that bloom spring, 3 types that bloom midsummer, and 3 types that bloom in the fall. Want to protect nests and egg laying sites. So that might mean leaving some of your leaves in the fall on the ground so that bees and other insects can lay their eggs under there. Not mulching quite as heavily as you might. And then creating some space, so a shallow pan with rocks and a little bit of water is great for butterflies and bees to stop and rest and get a drink on. And then avoiding pesticides and herbicides, like I said before, planting outdoors, typically you have a lot of pest control just naturally through predation by birds and other insects. And then conducting research can be overwhelming. So taking some time to just sort of sort through maybe some reputable websites and stuff like that can help narrow down your focus. So I listed some of those resources. The Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program will tell you a lot about the native plants that grow in Pennsylvania. Ecological Gardening has really good resources for plant selection for in your garden bed. The Xerces Society can tell you about bees and other pollinators, as well as Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. I like because they list what plants are larval hosts. Oops. Touchy mouse. And then for sourcing plants, the native plant nursery at Audubon at Beechwood Farms is fabulous. And that's in the Fox Chapel area in Pittsburgh. You can also catalog order from Prairie Moon Nursery. Both of these use responsible seed collection and propagation techniques and primarily grow natives. So what's to come as far as pollinator gardens go for us? We've recently received funding again from Next Era Energy to retrofit our garden at Grant Street and First Street downtown to create a full large-scale pollinator garden, which is very exciting. You know, we'll keep working on projects like that in the future. Obviously, visit our website if you'd like to learn more about what the Gardens and Green Space team does and find volunteer opportunities, and then the Conservancy site as well. Thank you so much. I hope we all learned about pollinators.
Okay, Lori, we have a couple questions for you. So our first question from Autumn is, how do you control weeds in your pollinator gardens?
We pull them by hand. Luckily, we have a lot of, our department has many dedicated garden stewards that help us with that. There are a variety of weed controls. Avoiding pesticides is really essential in timing when pulling weeds. So you want to start pulling weeds as soon as the ground is soft enough to do so, and continue doing that through when you've got hard frosts. But you can also use barriers, like you can lay down some cardboard if you have a really weedy patch for a season. That will help sort of suppress that, as well as mulching. You just don't want to go too terribly heavy in the fall due to like protecting pollinators, but summer you can definitely do a heavy application of mulch to suppress weeds.
Okay, our second question from an anonymous attendee is it possible to get a copy of these slides, or do you have a list of the recommended plants on your website? All 3 of our presentations are being recorded and will be posted on our website shortly. And we will be working this winter to get all our planting lists on the website for all our conditions in our community gardens for both container gardening, and pollinator gardening, as well as the stormwater plant lists, and any other plant list we can think of. So check back frequently on the webpage, and hopefully that stuff will get posted soon. Our next question from Autumn again. Does deer resistant also mean rabbit resistant? I planted salvia for the first time this year and someone ate it to the ground.
So not always. It seems like I've seen in my yard that rabbits are not as deterred by those minty fragrances as deer. And it's sadly also going to be dependent on how hungry your deer are. So some deer might eat some minty things. Resistant just means it's going to be less appealing than maybe say like the soft growth of your rose bush or something like that. There are no plants that are truly going to keep a deer from eating it, except for maybe a prickly pear cactus.
I don't know if that's native.
It is native.
Oh, okay, there you go. Next question, what is the best way to control pests? This year I had a lot of trouble with stink bugs killing monarch caterpillars.
I have to say I don't know the answer to that. I've seen stink bug traps. But yeah, that's not an issue we've had at our gardens, and I've not had that issue at home, but that's disappointing to hear.
It was a very heavy year for beetles as well. So yeah, I think the best way with the stink bugs are the traps. That's the best non-pesticide way to deal with them. Next question. We have 27 mature oaks and a lot of dry shade. We are getting rid of our grass in favor of moss and a dry meadow. What advice do you have?
Definitely there are a lot of plants that do really well in dry shade, especially native like woodland plants. I know that, again, the native plant nursery at Audubon had quite a few. Some things I can think of off the top of my head would be wild ginger typically does well in dry shade, as well as some violets. And certainly you should definitely be able to find a plant list specific to dry shade on Audubon's website, and then we will have ours up in the winter as well.
Okay, that was the last question. We'll give it a quick second in case anybody has any more questions they want to type in. I'll just take a minute to thank Lori for putting this presentation together.
Oh, yeah.
The rest of our community gardens and green space team who are out there every day, especially this time of year, getting things wrapped up for the winter and getting those trees in the ground. It is tree planting season. Oh, looks like we got one more question. Oh, it was just thank you. So
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for watching. We're about out of time here, but if anybody does have any questions, please check out our website, Waterland Life. If you feel a need to get out and volunteer, there are plenty of volunteer opportunities in small groups given COVID, and we are gearing up for next spring as well. So we'll be back at it in the spring. So keep an eye on the webpage, and soon we'll get the planting lists out.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.